This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome to Balance Debate for the Old North State. We're going to open this show with a topic grabbing the most headlines, the effort to end gun violence. Funding over the Atlantic Coast Pipeline has taken on a life of its own, and we'll update you on that subject. We've got another lawsuit, this one asking the court to invalidate a 2016 special legislative session. Then we'll look at President Trump's infrastructure proposals and how they might impact our state. And of course, as always, we ask our panel to tell us something we don't know. Speaking of the panel, on this week's panel, we've got John Hood, syndicated columnist and author, Peg O'Connell, political analyst and lobbyist, Phil Kirk, who has more accolades, but the last one, former chair of the State Board of Education, and Chris Fitzsimon, political analyst and columnist. We'll begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
Quality of life enjoyed by North Carolinians comes from the sacrifice of our state and local government retirees. These men and women risked their lives in times of danger. They taught our children, kept our neighborhoods clean, and protected the state's resources. They are North Carolina's silent heroes. The North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association proudly serves as the voice for more than 300,000 retirees across North Carolina. Our retirees deserve no less, and every day we stand by them.
Got a lot to talk about. Let's get started. Every time there's a school shooting or act of gun violence, we can expect to hear a chorus of folks demanding stricter gun control laws, followed just as quickly and vehemently by those telling us that regulating guns won't solve the problems. Following the Valentine's Day killing of 17 students at Stoneman Douglas High in Parkland, Florida, we saw young people start a movement that's taking hold in North Carolina and throughout the United States. Phil Kirk, author Malcolm Gladwell, has a book talking about the tipping point, a point where he says an effort finally gets critical mass, it tips over, and things start getting done. Do you think this young people's movement might be the tipping point on action on gun violence?
I'm hoping that it will, but it will be a balanced approach. It won't be one side or the other. I don't anticipate any major gun control, but I think some things like raising the age to buy guns, better background checks. I also think, it's in the case in Florida, there were several hints that young man was going to do something. So I think while some might object, I think we need to give the judges more authority to deal with that. And then one other thing that I think is important, a lot of young people knew that young man was trouble, yeah. And I think we need to, without damaging somebody's reputation, Peg, I think we need to share that more.
Peg, do you think this new energy, this new movement is because it's being led by young people?
Well, I think that's a big part of it, and it's very hard. We saw last night a time where Marco Rubio went toe-to-toe with a young kid who asked him, are you going to take any more money from the NRA?
Yeah, that was Rubio, Wednesday night, yeah.
Wednesday night. And Rubio kind of came undone. I mean, he didn't have a good response. It's hard to look a young person in the eye and give them the typical political BS. And I want to say one thing. You know, this gun violence in the United States is a public health issue. It's not right or it's not left. People are dying. They died in Florida. They die every single day, whether it's 1-on-1 or 1-on-17. We have to deal with this like a public health issue. If somebody walked into a classroom covered in smallpox, would someone say, that guy's got a right to have smallpox and he's allowed to touch everybody? Of course not.
Yeah, John, speaking about the young people, folks on the gun side, gun activists.
The Constitution.
Yeah.
People who defend the Constitution,
okay.
...
That's not my question. Here's my question. They're saying these kids are just actors. They're being put up to this by liberals and Democrats. And
I suppose there are a couple of kooks saying that. That is not the primary response from people who defend the Second Amendment.
Heard it a lot, haven't you, Chris?
Well, I have heard it a lot. There was a lot on social media about it, and nobody's talking about repealing the Second Amendment. We already put limits on guns. You can't have a submachine gun right now in the United States. You can't have one, can't buy one. The question is, where does the Second Amendment intersect with how it's applied, or how is it applied? I think there's a lot of people that believe, as the president apparently does, that you should be able to have 21 to be able to buy this kind of weapon. There's questions about why this weapon is available. There's question about magazines. There's question about mental. It's interesting to me that President Trump a couple weeks ago proposed cutting mental health funding and school safety funding. There's all sorts of issues here. Guns are part of it, whether we want to talk about it or not. The Second Amendment should not be the only one that is completely sacrosanct, that we don't talk about how it's applied.
Phil, last Tuesday, a group of 500, mostly students, gathered at Pullen Baptist Church in Raleigh and marched on the state capitol. They lit 17 candles in honor of the 17 who were killed and took them and put them on the Capitol steps. How significant are demonstrations like this? They're calling for kids to walk out of their schools on March 14th, and they're calling for a march on Washington. How much influence does that have?
Well, and I wouldn't limit this comment to just on guns and safety. I've always felt it brought the attention to it, but influence in legislators, I haven't seen that in the past. I do think the young people being involved is a different angle. But how much, I don't know.
You say it's not influencing people, but yet we hear a Marco Rubio stand up and say he's willing to raise the age on automatic weapons, semi-automatic weapons.
I'm glad he said that. I agree with
We hear some other politicians, gosh, President Trump, whose campaign received huge amounts of money from the NRA, is now saying he's willing to start taking some action along these lines. So you say it doesn't.
I hope it does.
And I agree with Phil. I hope that the things that they're saying, they start to follow through. Those are nibbling around the edges, but at least it's a step in that direction. We've got to do something. And there are common sense measures that are well within constitutional parameters that we can start. As Chris said, the Second Amendment isn't any more popular or any more powerful than, I think, unfortunately, it may be more popular than the First Amendment, but every single part of the Constitution and the right of the people to live in a free society is important, and the Second Amendment doesn't trump all that.
But in talking about all of this, NRA President Wayne LaPierre spoke to CPAC this past week. Doesn't look like he's budging, and his organization are budging much at all insofar as any changes on gun control legislation.
Well, they're going to support and have supported better background checks. I'm not sure they're against gun violence protective orders as exist in some states. It's been proposed in North Carolina that would target people who actually, as Phil was getting at, you may have real evidence that someone's guns need to be taken away because they've got some kind of a problem. That has a process. It goes in front of a judge. That's not something that Second Amendment activists typically are opposed to. What they're opposed to is what a lot of people say. What they really want is to ban rifles in the United States. There are millions and millions of semi-automatic rifles. They will never be banned. They will never be confiscated. That is a waste of time to talk about.
I think the vast majority of people would oppose the banning of rifles.
Except you are talking about a movement, the specific demand of which is to ban these rifles. That is specifically what they want.
I would vote in favor of banning AR-15.
And that would never happen because that's a standard issue weapon that millions of people own.
And
it's never going to happen.
For civilians in the first place. The other thing is the vast majority of NRA members believe in universal background checks, not tweaking the background checks. Why can you walk into a gun show in most states and buy an AR-15 without even an ID if you have cash? Why is that allowed in a civilized society?
And 97% of the populace.
You cannot do that
yes,
unless you are buying from someone who is not a dealer.
Well, why should that be legal?
Individuals selling each other a gun occasionally is different from a dealer.
If I buy a car from you, I have to
understand, but it has nothing to do with the gun show whatsoever. It can happen in your
backyard. I think every time somebody buys a firearm, that there should be a background check performed in some capacity.
One could make an argument for that, but I just want people to understand there is absolutely no law that has anything to do with gun shows. There is zero exceptions at gun shows.
And
that
perhaps maybe it's
except
time
where
to
people show up. Well, except when people show up, and that's where individuals sell the guns.
Right, but the vast majority of what happens at gun shows are with dealers, and they are subject to background checks.
But 40% of guns, roughly 30 to 40% of guns, are bought without a background check. That's a fundamental problem.
They do not occur at gun shows.
Well, it doesn't matter where they occur. If somebody buys an AR-15 without an ID or somebody knowing about it, that's a big problem.
The vast majority of AR-15s are sold by dealers, and there's a background check.
Hey, can we move off this for just a little bit? We'll let Chris and John go fight somewhere else.
With a gun?
No guns. No guns. So far as it goes, we talked about the NRA. Senator Richard Burr has received $6.99 million from the NRA. Senator Tom Tillis, $4.4 million. We got a number of legislators who've received money from the NRA. The NRA says we ought to be able to give the money to the people that we want. A lot of people say these politicians are just bought and paid for. You've lived in the political world for a while. What do you think?
Well, you know, I don't know that anybody is ever really bought and paid for, but it's very, very difficult to take a large amount of money from a group that you're philosophically aligned with and then turn your back on them. So, I mean, whether Richard Burr, and we've talked about this before, takes money from the NRA because he agrees with them, or the NRA gives him money because they hope they'll buy his loyalty. I don't know whether that's a chicken or an egg, but, you know, that's a whole other kettle of fish, if you'll pardon the mixed metaphors. There's just so much money in politics. And it's hard to
Phil,
disassemble.
a lot of people continually say guns aren't the problem, people are. Well, one of the signs at the Raleigh rally really struck me. It was sort of funny and not so funny at the same time. It says, hey, Burr and Tillis, if guns aren't the problem, then why is your office behind metal detectors? So far as it goes, our own legislature is thinking about installing metal detectors. If they're not worried about guns, why are they doing this?
Well, I'm surprised the legislature hadn't put those in earlier. I don't have any problem with the metal detectors, and I don't know that that's the real issue. But yeah, there need to be more safety precautions in schools too.
John, you've been, and I think rightly so, a lot of us standing up for the Second Amendment. I agree with the Second Amendment. I would go to the end with you to be able to own a gun, which, by the way, I know you do not. So
that's correct.
Under the circumstances.
Let's not talk about that. I might. We don't talk about that sort of thing in public.
I hope you would not bring it to NC Spin. House Speaker Tim Moore held a press conference earlier this week, and somebody asked him about this issue. He says, now's not the time to be discussing gun control issues. Well, these teenagers down in Parkland, Florida are saying, if not now, when? Hasn't that been a standard response all through the years? Not the time.
What they usually say is this isn't the time to get into policy weeds because we're in the midst of a tragedy or the immediate aftermath. But they talk about gun control all the time, every year. It is, I think, preposterous to suggest, well, we just really haven't had a conversation about gun control. Gun control has been a central element of American politics for something like 30 years, and it will continue to be.
But the issue is we talk about it, we've never done anything about it.
What they want is legislation, not a conversation.
Interestingly, though, after the Las Vegas shooting, the biggest shooting ever in terms of casualties, there was sort of agreement for a moment about banning something called bump stocks.
Yeah.
Well, they're still legal. That was in October. I haven't seen
President Trump.
President Trump says and the ATF says that you can't do it with regulation. The statute requires legislation. Well, there's been legislation already introduced in Congress that hasn't moved 1 inch. So when is the time to talk about it? Las Vegas was October 1st. This is the end of February.
Again, I understand the point, and I favor passing that bill, but we've already talked about it. The point about, no one ever talks about gun control. We talk about it all the time. If we have some things we all agree on, let's pass it now.
Yeah, okay. Well, I feel kind of like the guy in the old days in the Roman Colosseum that would go toss the red meat out on the floor before they turned the lions loose. Here's the final question I want to ask in this subject, and that is President Trump, one of our legislators, a number of people saying the solution to this, or one solution to this, is let's give our teachers guns. Peg, what do you think? Do you want a teacher who's packing?
Well, fortunately for me, or the school, I am way too old to be in school. But of course not. You don't want teachers with guns. You don't want kids with guns. You don't want principals with guns. Schools have
I'm worried about my neighbor.
Trained law enforcement, which it's very sad that we have to have trained law enforcement in schools. That's their role. Can you imagine if everybody had pulled out a gun in Florida and started shooting? schools should not be a shoot out of the OK
Phil,
corral.
I know you want your teachers, your grandchildren's teachers to have guns.
Well, I think that's been blown way out of proportion. When I first saw this headline, I thought that's the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard of. But then I read where they're talking about 20% of teachers and having them well trained. It's not what is being presented. I'm still not sure it's a good idea.
I love our teachers. I respect our teachers. There are teachers who make bad decisions and have bad judgments. I'm not sure I want my teacher packing.
Well, I don't want most of them to have them, but I think
John, what's your take on guns with teachers?
Well, my first take is simply that we had an armed officer at the scene who did not intervene. Let's immediately focus on resource officers and first responders, make sure they're trained, and make sure that they go in and stop the shooter. That's the fundamental fact that has come out in the last week that we need to understand.
Yes.
There was an armed guard there who should have acted.
Well,
Didn't do his job.
I agree with that, and he should have done his job. I think it'd be insane to give 20. Actually, the figure is 20 to 40% of teachers. We already, I think, don't trust teachers. People don't trust teachers, and now all of a sudden they want to give them a gun. The second thing is they say it will deter people. Then we talk about this was a mentally ill kid who didn't have his head on right. Well, then we're going to expect a mentally ill person to react rationally and know that there are teachers in the schools with guns. None of it makes any sense.
Well, for more on this, I suggest you read my column this week on at ncspin.com. Another area where there seems to be a lot of talk, little movement, concerns the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Following our story last week, our lead story, there's been a lot of rhetoric regarding how the $58 million fund got created, who was involved, and how it was to be administered. Chris, I think the last time we saw such a can of worms opened over a statewide subject was HB 2. The legislature last week sent Governor Cooper a list of 15 questions they wanted answered. Cooper has refused to answer them. Now the legislature's talking about issuing a subpoena. Is this just more partisan politics, or there's some legitimate reason here for finding the answers?
Mostly the first, but a little bit of both. I do think that to compare it to HB2 is sort of the Republicans' dream. They want this to be HB2. They think it's like Watergate, apparently. Remember, this is not going to happen. The General Assembly, whether it's right or wrong, tied this to a class size reduction bill. So now they're trying to get at what the motives of what Governor Cooper may or may not have agreed to and when he agreed to it. I think it's worth looking into to talk about how these things operate in the future if it ever happens again. But I think this is being completely blown out of proportion. It's as if the Republicans and a lot of their supporters smell blood in the water and they think, oh, this is it. We're going to get Cooper on some massive scandal. It's really not there.
John, the chairs of the House and Senate Joint Rules Committee made a great point of saying that they had requested answers to these, because that was one of the subjects we asked last week about why hadn't the legislature asked for answers here. They say they asked for answers to these questions February 8th and again on February 12th with Cooper's lobbyist. Now, if memory serves me correctly, isn't this the same meeting in which the legislature just excoriated and basically humiliated Lee Lilly in an open meeting? The former lobbyist for a public utility had just been on the job several days. Wasn't that the same meeting?
It was the meeting where they asked him questions he could not answer. This is really not a complicated problem.
You're saying he was not treated badly in that meeting?
He was asked tough questions and he had horrible answers. I don't know what else to say. The questioning was very aggressive.
Listening to that meeting, he was not treated with much respect.
Okay, and he did not treat them with respect by having any meaningful answer. This is a very simple question. Then they should send somebody else to answer the question. Here's the fundamental problem. This is a very simple issue. Either the gift from the utilities, just a free and open gift to the state, in which case it's a state revenue and the governor had no business claiming control over it, or it was an unconstitutional exaction of payment from a regulated entity, unconstitutional under federal and state law, and a violation of the law. Either of those things, the governor has no good answer. That's why they won't answer the questions. They simply do not have a meaningful, persuasive defense of what they did. That's the problem they've got.
Well, I don't think we know exactly what happened, and there have been so darn many different.
Those are the only two options. Those are literally the only two possibilities.
There are various stories about this. The big issue seems to be, how did the agreement for this funding take place? Would you agree with that?
Actually, it doesn't even matter.
Why?
Because the governor then asserted control over state revenue. Okay. So the origins of it are not the point.
All right.
I think he got some poor advice, frankly.
I think most everybody, regardless of which side of the fence you sit on, could say that the governor didn't handle it well and certainly did not explain himself very well.
It looked like a fight that didn't need to happen.
Well, I mean, just from a legal perspective, there is precedent for this kind of thing. When Mike Easley negotiated the settlement with the tobacco companies, the master settlement agreement, which we weren't even allowed to be a party to, he directed in the settlement agreement that half the money that comes to the state every year, which is $140 million a year, goes into the Golden Leaf Fund. So
and he had no authority to do that without the legislature approving it, which they did.
They finally
did. That is in the budget.
But Chris, let me
to your point, John, then
Chris, let me ask you this question though. Let's go back to this business about the governor and a slush fund and all of this kind of stuff. Okay, let's assume that the legislature didn't get their panties in a wad about all of this kind of stuff and turned around and said, okay, we're going to listen to this. There is a fund that has been created here. Even if they decided how to direct it, wouldn't they have to turn it over to some executive agency or administrative agency in state government to dole out the funds?
Well,
they don't have the mechanism to do that.
Right, but the Golden Leaf Foundation does that every month, I think, or whenever they have their board meetings. And that's the other point about this other discussion about the Golden Leaf Foundation. The legislature did approve it, and then it went into effect. The legislature didn't approve this one, so it's not going into effect. So
but they could have.
They could have. That's right.
All right. If it's seeming to you like nobody in government in North Carolina can get along with each other, you've got a pretty good sense of what's going on in today's landscape. Just this week, we learned of another lawsuit in which a 3-judge Superior Court panel is being asked to invalidate actions taken in a special session back in December 2016 on the grounds that the session violated the Constitution. Peg, so the clause that has the plaintiffs convinced the session was unconstitutional comes from Article 3, Paragraph 7 of the Constitution. It says, the governor may, on extraordinary occasions, convene the legislature in extra session by his proclamation, stating therein the purpose or purposes for which they are thus convened. Now, the plaintiffs say there was no advance notice given about this particular special session. You're an attorney. How do you respond to this?
Well, first of all, I think the issue in this case, at least from my reading of it, and I haven't read the legal documents, I have read the news reports, is not so much that specific statement, but that members of the citizens of North Carolina must advise their members of the General Assembly, must instruct their members of the General Assembly. So that's what they're litigating right now. The other thing is, this is not this session was not called by the governor. This session was called by the legislature itself, which has the power to do that.
Right. Let's go back historically, because we talked about this quite a bit at the time on NC Spin. Okay, so Pat McCrory, the governor, called a special session. It was to deal with Hurricane Matthew relief funds. The legislature met. They dealt with that issue, then adjourned, then called themselves back into special session.
2 hours later.
That's the part about this whole thing that
and the argument is, to take Peg's point, the argument is that when the legislature then did that, there had not been enough advance notice for the voters to then participate in instructing their lawmakers. Now, I think the problem they've got here, I think that this case is unlikely to work because lots of people then instructed their legislature. In other words, it wasn't called into special session. They passed a bill in 3 seconds. There was no public discussion.
Well, 44 hours, much better.
I understand, but my point is, we might not like the fact that there was not enough time, but there's no constitutional requirement that you need 72 hours or 96 hours instead of 40 hours. I think this is where they're going to have trouble.
And the judges asked what is a reasonable period of time.
And I think the plaintiffs, Burton Craig, the lawyer, was basically saying that we don't have an exact time, but this is such an extreme version that clearly it violates this. And I think it's I'm not sure if it's unconstitutional. It was certainly a terrible way to run state government. The question is, does it violate the Constitution? I want to make one other point. And one of the other judges said, well, why is this language in there at all? It has to mean something. I mean, there is language in the Constitution that says that.
Phil, what's got everybody upset here are the 2 bills that they passed, which was HB 17 and then Senate Bill 4. HB 17 was another one of these Christmas tree type bills that the legislature passed, took power away from the governor, all because an incoming Democrat was going to be assuming the office of governor. The HB 4 dealt with the State Board of Elections and the Ethics Commission and so forth like that. Would we be having this discussion if these bills had not been what they were?
Yes.
You think?
But it wouldn't have been as high. No, it wouldn't have been as high a level. But I think there's some people impact most of us probably that are concerned about the process, no matter which party,
Exactly.
which party does it.
And the people's faith in the system.
Yeah, this whole discussion deserves more talk, and we will do it because there's another aspect of this, but we need to get to the point where all the viewers tell me they like on our show, which is when we ask the panel to tell us something.
They don't like the other part, Tom?
No,
we don't usually argue with each other.
That's the cake. This is the icing. John, tell us something we don't know.
3 recent polls have come out of North Carolina voters looking to the 2018 midterm elections. In all 3 cases, the generic ballot questions, would you vote R or D for Congress or legislature, were tied. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not consistent right now with a massive Democratic wave.
All right, Peg O'Connell, tell us something we don't know.
So over the last 8 years, 105 million pills have been disposed of safely by a project called Operation Medicine Drop, which was created by Safe Kids North Carolina as a poison prevention initiative to get medicines out of the hands of kids. It has now become a major tool in the fight of against the opioid epidemic by getting these opioids out of people's cupboards and properly disposed of.
Phil Kirk, tell us something we don't know.
Homeschooling. We now have almost 100,000 children in homeschools. In my home county of Rowan, which is in Salisbury, which is a medium-sized district, there are 2,500 in homeschools. They're now studying ways that they can work with the public.
Chris, 20 seconds. Tell us something we
I
don't
was
know.
fascinated by another poll. Elon just found out 9% of the people know who Phil Berger is. 11%, I think, know who House Speaker Tim Moore is. Legislators of both parties always think they're statewide figures. Even the most powerful ones are not.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback and read my column. Be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, and join us next week. We'll have more balanced debate on the Old North State. Until then, stay informed. Watch out for the spin.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
Quality of life enjoyed by North Carolinians comes from the sacrifice of our state and local government retirees. These men and women risked their lives in times of danger. They taught our children, kept our neighborhoods clean, and protected the state's resources. They are North Carolina's silent heroes. The North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association proudly serves as the voice for more than 300,000 retirees across North Carolina. Our retirees deserve no less, and every day we stand by them.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.